Feel like one of these country stations about to announce 4 in a row. Mr. Armstrong is in San Antonio again this week. I mean, it's not again this week, but he is in San Antonio this week, visiting with a church down there, and he allowed me the privilege of speaking to you the 4th time in succession. I think that what I will do as a result of that is insist that he has to take the next 4 so that I can sit at home and have a cup of coffee and relax and enjoy the Sabbath. Not that I didn't anyway this morning, but it's nice to have a chance to talk with you again. Few issues can be raised in church more sensitive than money. I don't anybody leave immediately, just hang on for just a minute. Personally, I have heard more resentment expressed over church's fundraising than any other single policy of a church. And by this I mean any kind of church, be it Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or Catholic or what have you, that I've heard people sit around and say, I hadn't been in that church 2 minutes till the preacher was preaching about, money, and they passed the plate under my nose. Of course, some of you have noticed that we haven't passed the plate around here since the last Holy Day. We don't bother doing that in the Church of God. But anyway, I think probably second place among all the things that churches have problems over is spending. And that is, fundraising and spending. Of course, that's about the way it is with the federal government, too, isn't it? It's all in question of fundraising and spending is where all the trouble seems to come from. I know I have gotten to where I'm reluctant to speak on the subject. I kind of hate to bring it up from time to time because of people's sensitivities. I know Mr. Ted Armstrong hates to write fundraising letters. It aggravates him to even say, we have an opportunity before us. Will you all support it? Which basically, you'd kind of feel bad if you were left out of the opportunity. I think I would, but nevertheless, because of a lot of things that have happened in the past, he's reluctant to even mention money, much less ask for money, much less, quote, beg, end quote, for money. I think really very few people can appreciate the depth of his reluctance or where the well springs of it come from. They go very, very deep. If you ever are interested, you might ask him to tell you why it is that he is so reluctant to ever bring up the question. Comparing Mr. Ted Armstrong's co-worker or donor letters to those of, say, Herbert W. Armstrong or Oral Roberts or the PTL Club or one of those groups is grossly unfair because he is not even in the same league with those master fundraisers. I think much of the resentment and the cynicism grows out of the repeated abuse of fundraising that takes place among, I guess, just about every type or every stripe of religionist that there is. The reason I think that television ministries come under so much fire is just simply because they are so much more visible. So many more people are exposed to them and their fundraising methods than would be, say, the Green Acres Baptist Church or Marvin Methodist Church, 2 local churches here in Tyler. Some of these television ministries basically amount to very little more than prayer peddlers. It's the best terminology that I can put on it. What they are doing in many cases is playing the odds, and I'll tell you basically what I mean by that. They have their television program on the air, and they offer that they will certainly pray for you, and sometimes they will pray for you over the air. I remember one of them used to talk about, well, now you lay your hand on the radio, or at first, they started talking about radiation from television sets. He'd tell you to come up and put your hand against his hand on the television screen to get a point of contact, and he would pray for you right there over the air. And then when you get on the mailing list for some of these, they send out a slip for you to fill in your prayer request. My prayer request, brother so-and-so, is this. And you write in your prayer request. And either at the bottom of it or over on the other side, depending upon how direct the fellow wants to be, my contribution is this amount of money. My pledge for 1984 will be so many dollars per month, so many dollars per week, and so forth on the other side. Now, basically, in one sense of the word, what many of these people are doing, whether they will admit it or not, even to themselves, is they're playing the odds. Because if you get 1,000 people out here to write in a little slip of paper, you says, pray for me, I'm out of work. All 1,000 of them are out of work, right? Okay, in the course of the next month, how many of that 1,000 do you suppose will get a job? 50? 100? 150? 200? All righty. They have written in their prayer request. They mailed it off with $1 or $2 enclosed in it. And a week later, they got a job. Do they make a connection? You bet they make a connection. Do they then tie into that? Sure they tie into it. And it becomes a very effective means of raising money. Now, let me ask you, how many of you believe that if you're sending in a Reader's Digest sweepstakes or American Publishing House or American Family Publishers or whatever they are, sweepstakes, you're going to fill in the sweepstakes thing and send it back in. How many of you believe that you have less of a chance to win in that sweepstake if you do not buy the magazine or the book? May I ask you to raise? How many of you believe you have less of a chance to win? Now, I want to tell you why you feel that way. The whole thing is designed to make you feel that you have less of a chance to win. They want you to feel, to believe, that you have a better chance to win if you subscribe to whatever it is than if you don't. Because it is against the law for them to require you to buy the product without, in order to enter the sweepstakes. And most of them, I think Reader's Digest certainly does, and I think American Family does, they all hire independent monitoring firms to take complete charge of the sweepstakes process and to guarantee that the persons who are receiving these are receiving them completely impartially. Because you see, if you have to buy the product in order to be eligible for the sweepstakes, it becomes gambling of a sort, and I think would come under all sorts of federal prohibitions and the mails and state laws and so forth. But it is written up in such a way to sort of make you feel. In fact, you have to hunt. You have to dig and scratch and gouge sometimes and down through all these papers to find that one little fine print says no purchase required. But it has to be there somewhere in that publication in order to be legal. All right. Now, what you need to realize is that is precisely the same psychology that is at work in that prayer request. That you will tend to believe that you have just that marginal little bit better chance of having your prayer answered if you make a donation to this preacher than you will if you don't make a donation to the preacher. Next time you see one of those in the mail, just take a good long look at it and consider the psychology that is involved in this. It really amounts to some sort of a prayer sweepstakes is what it really boils down to that many of them are using. There are others who are always looking for a new gimmick. I remember one night I was driving up back from, I believe we were driving back from Lowakie, Texas, back up to Abilene. On our anniversary, we'd gone down to Lowakie to really a great steakhouse down there for dinner that night. We're driving back. I was listening to these radio preachers because I had just gotten interested in one of them called Herbert W. Armstrong. And I was dialing along listening. Here this one guy came on, and he was reading testimonials over the air from people who had sent him a donation and had received in return his prosperity billfold. Now, he had these little plastic billfolds. You may have had them yourself. It had a little scripture on the back of it about how God wants you to, above all things, to prosper and be in health. And basically his pitch was, you send me a donation, I'll send you one of these prosperity billfolds, and God will fill it up. You know, they're a little plastic thing. They crack after you've had them in your pocket for about a month and begin to fall apart. God will fill this thing up. I mean, he'd read testimonial after testimonial after testimonial. He got a lot of money from people. Make him a $5 donation, he'd send him a 15-cent plastic billfold. Cost him 5 cents, or I don't know what it cost him in those days to mail it out. Wasn't that much. And he was making money like it was going out of style down there, I presume. If he could get enough people who were foolish enough to believe that God would fill that billfold up that he sent to them. But he kept reading those testimonials, and he kept right on playing the odds, and sure enough, there were people that helped that old boy earn a living for an awful lot of years off of sending out prosperity billfolds. And he didn't do much of anything else in a 15-minute broadcast except promote those prosperity billfolds. I wish I'd written off and got one of those things a lot earlier in my life. Maybe it would have helped. Then there was the day, in order to keep track of what all these people are doing, I have written into an awful lot of PTL Club and Oral Roberts and a whole bunch of them just to watch how they handle their mailings. One day I opened my mail up, and here is an anniversary card. Now, that's funny, and opened it up, and there was no signature or anything. And I looked at the letter that came with it. The letter was from Tammy Faye Baker of the PTL Club. And there, she and Jim Baker's anniversary was coming up. And she wrote this personal letter to me, It said, Dear Mr. Dart, at the top of it. Must have been personal. And it seemed to be signed at the bottom. Of course, we all know they're computer-generated letters, and they're all just run off, automatically. and your name is put in there automatically. In fact, they can insert your name 3 or 4 times down in this letter and make it look like that is written for you and for you alone. Well, she wanted me to know that hers and Jim's anniversary was coming up. Now, frankly, if Cecil and Opal Reese over here, if Opal came to me and said, Ron, our anniversary's coming up, we want you and Allie to give Cecil and I an anniversary present, I would think that was a trifle strange, if I knew when their anniversary was, I'd kind of want to mention it in some way, send them a card or something, but I would think that was a trifle strange. But she not only tells me when it is so that I can do something about it, she even sent me the card, which was very considerate. Because I didn't have to go out and buy a card for their anniversary. I had the card right there. All I had to do was say, Happy Anniversary, Jim, at the bottom of it, sign it, Ron. Oh, I forgot. They also wanted me to enclose a contribution as a kind of anniversary present to them for the work and so forth. Now, of course, I kind of wonder about that. If I got $100,000 next week in anniversary presents, do you reckon I would have any income tax consequences as a result of receiving all those anniversary presents? It'd be an interesting question. I could look at Larry, who knows a little bit about that, and he's looking non-committal, giving me his best non-committal look because I'm not paying for this advice right now. But also, he may not know. I don't know, because it could be a very complicated question, as to whether or not that is to the corporation or to the person, and so forth. But anyway, it was a gimmick. Basically, they're looking for a gimmick to how can we raise some money? Maybe a prosperity billfold, or my anniversary is coming up, or something else, whatever it may happen to be. I think they were using some sort of a gimmick like that to try to raise money for a new video van for Jimmy Swaggart's organization not long ago. Oral Roberts sent me a letter offering to seal my name. My name was going to be put into a capsule and sealed into the foundation of his brand new medical center up there in Oklahoma if I just sent a contribution of X number of dollars, I forget what it was, and became a sort of a partner with him in helping him build that building. But I could have my name sealed up in the thing there. Oral Roberts' seed faith method, it comes right out and says your chances are better if you give an offering. That's basically what the whole thing is all about, the seed faith thing. Is you're supposed to plant a seed, and then God will give it back to you. Okay, you have a prayer request, you've got to give us some money. That is your seed. You've got to put something in if you expect to get something out. Again, playing the odds. Others are monument builders. Rex Humbard had this gigantic prayer tower that he was building up there in Canada someplace, and it almost, I don't know if it did eat him up or not, but I haven't seen Rex Humbard on the air in a long, long time, and I know he was in deep financial trouble because he had begun to build that monument, put his money into that instead of putting his money back into television time. Robert Schuller built a Crystal Cathedral and immediately got into financial trouble himself because of cost overruns and so forth. Oral Roberts built his medical center up there, and Herbert W. Armstrong built Ambassador Auditorium. And so on it goes when the monuments begin to be built. Others are crisis-oriented. Mr. Herbert Armstrong is probably the most active practitioner of the crisis. At least he's the one I know the best, because it seemed to me when I was getting co-work letters that there was a monthly crisis. And if it wasn't, in and directly in the church, it was a crisis in the world. But you begin to check his co-work, read him very carefully, and you will find that his basic orientation is a crisis orientation. I remember one time the crisis was so great that all of us in the church were urged to go down to our local banker and to take out a signature loan of, I forget what it was that they wanted us to do, was $500 or $1,000, and send into the work, because they figured that we'd all been hit pretty hard on donations recently, so we probably didn't have anything anymore. So the whole idea was go borrow some and then pay it back over time. We need, and I forget the crisis. It was a big crisis, but we had to send in this money to meet the crisis. A publication not long after that published the invoice, the purchase order invoice and so forth, for I think it was a $50,000 crystal chandelier that was bought very shortly after, right at the same time that this crisis was generated, and all of us were asked to go down to the bank and borrow money and send in. Also, another method that is used in the crisis orientation is time is short, the end of the world is coming, and you're not going to need that money anyway, you might as well send it in to us. Others are opportunity oriented. They seize upon whatever opportunity happens to come along. Something happens, and we say, we can use this to generate some money to the work. That is one of the most normal and most frequently used methods that there is. I was really sobered, though, the other day. I just, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I was watching Oral Roberts on Sunday morning, and I was really shocked because I had read Patty Roberts' book, and I knew some of the trauma of her life and of Richard Roberts and what they had been through, and the story of their divorce and his subsequent remarriage to Lindsay. And I had known, because I had seen an earlier television program, Lindsay on the air, pregnant and expecting a baby. And this Sunday I saw them. I believe they were showing some previous scenes of Lindsay and being pregnant and expecting the baby and how it was a miracle from God and all these type of things. And then they shifted back, and that was when I learned that the baby had only lived for 36 hours and had died. And what I was seeing was a memorial service for the child being conducted on the campus of Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, and here on stage, and it was Oral and his wife, and Richard and Lindsay Roberts were there in their grief 36 hours later, and conducting a memorial service for this child and talking about, how their faith had not been diminished by it and so forth. And as I watched, I could not believe my eyes. Oral Roberts turned that opportunity into an opportunity to raise money for his medical center to build an obstetrics ward in the City of Faith Medical Center in Tulsa. And I thought, that's classic. I could not believe it. It was the ultimate appeal to pity in order to raise money, and did not even allow his own children a period of time of privacy for their grief before they were on television trying to raise money out of the death of his grandson. Just something that helps, I think, to go through these things, to help us all to get into perspective why people would be cynical about money and religion. And you see, everything that I have said up until this point, I have not suggested really that the money is all that much being used wrong. We can assume that all this money is being well used, and yet still find ourselves rather unhappy with the abuses of fundraising methods that people would be going through all the time. And I think perhaps you could also see why Mr. Armstrong might be embarrassed to ask for money in a letter. And it's even a strain for him to write out to the people and say, look, we've got a brand new opportunity. We can go on SPN. It's a satellite. We'll be in 400 outlets, 10.5 million homes. We want to go ahead with it. We are going ahead with it, and we've got to depend on all of you to help us with it financially. Because the truth to tell is, an awful lot of people really don't give unless they're asked. And when they are asked and they give, they don't give again until they're asked again. And so consequently, it seems like a logical thing to do, and it certainly is, I think, a right thing to do. Needs have to be made known. Fact of the matter is that even the Apostle Paul wrote a fundraising letter. I want you to turn back and take a look at his fundraising letter, because his approach, I think, is a little bit different, perhaps, than what some of these other people might use. The Apostle Paul, in chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians, first of all talks about things that are offered to idols and all of the things that people have done. Let's see if I can be sure. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. I think I wanted to be in 2 Corinthians 8, not 1 Corinthians 8. 2 Corinthians 8. He writing to these people, and he says, brethren, we want you to understand the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded to the riches of their gift. For to their power I bear record, yes, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering of the saints. And this they did not like we had hoped, but they first gave their own selves to God and to us by the will of God, insomuch that we desired Titus that as he had begun, so he would finish in you the same grace also. All that's happening here is the Apostle Paul is writing to Corinth, and he's saying, he said, I want you to know about the tremendous generosity of the churches up in Macedonia. I just think I want to blow their horn a little bit to make you realize what a tremendous gift they gave, how generous they were, how big-hearted, and how even out of their deep poverty, they were able to give it to their means, and yea, out and beyond their means, and getting this offering ready to go down to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, this is a straightforward fundraising letter, and he uses, if you hadn't known it was an old technique, you're surely going to know it now. It's just one of trying to provoke people to emulation. Just like me telling you people over here, I want you to understand how these people over here have given. How they have given to their means and even beyond their means, and they've just gone above and beyond. They have been so generous. And what I'm simply doing He's just putting a little bit of pressure on you to measure up to what they have done. Nothing particularly complicated about it. Even a little human reasoning, a little human psychology to try to help people to do something that they ought to do anyway. That's all that Paul is doing. He isn't raising the money for some nefarious purpose. He's raising goods, actually. He's raising food and whatever is necessary to sustain the poor saints in Jerusalem who are going to be undergoing a famine. He's just taken stuff down there for them. As far as we know, everything was taken to them except the cost of getting it there. There was no personal thing going on with the Apostle Paul at all. And so Paul goes on down through here, telling them again and again about all the things that he wanted them to do. He says in chapter 9, verse 1, "For as touching the ministering to the saints, why, it's superfluous to me to write to you, for I know the forwardness of your mind. For I boast of you to them of Achaia, to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago." Now I'm telling you people here, look, I've already boasted to these people over here that you people were ready a year ago. So I hope you are, because I've already boasted to them that you are. It makes you want to live up to the good name that I have already given you. Psychology? Yeah. Very effective psychology. And Paul seems to have had no special shame in using it. He said, "Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain on this behalf, that, as I said, you may be ready, lest haply, if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared, that we don't say you, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren that they would go before to you and make up beforehand your gift, whereof you had noticed before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty and not as covetousness. But I say, he that sows sparingly shall reap sparingly. He that sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. Every man, according as he has purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver." Beautiful, beautiful statement. And he says basically that you're going to be blessed for what you've done. And if you give little, you're not going to be blessed very much. If you give more, you're going to be blessed more. It's just a simple appeal to really, in a way, your own enlightened self-interest. That if you sow richly, you will reap richly. Every man, let him give, not grudgingly, not of necessity. God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace toward you abound, that you, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound in every good work. And so on he goes, exhorting and trying to get these people to understand the importance of them being willing to give to others. Now, this was no mere opportunism. It was a very real cause. It was a very real need. And Paul used every means at his disposal to try to encourage everybody to give what they could to help along the way. There seems to be a natural human drive to acquire and to accumulate. We like to get things. We like to earn money. We like to accumulate money. We like to own a nice car. We might want to own two of them. There's some people that like to trade cars and try to improve them. And it's all a part of a desire human beings seem to have to acquire and to accumulate. Even the very wealthy seem driven to acquire more. It's as though there never was enough. And you think to yourself, boy, that guy must be sick. He's got $5 million and he's trying to double his money. No, he's not sick. He's just normal. He's just following along the lines of a very normal human attitude or human drive to acquire. There is no comparable drive to give. Do you ever realize that? We have the drive to acquire. We have the desire to own, to get, to possess. There is nothing in us, no comparable drive to give. Why is that? Very simple. Because if it were there, you would exhaust yourself in short order and you would have nothing left either of yourself or your time or your energy left to give to anyone. There is a normal need on for a human being to draw to himself rather than giving everything away from himself. For, truth to tell, very shortly, he would have nothing left to give. Now, a human being may learn to enjoy giving. In fact, we pretty well have to learn to enjoy giving. It may make us feel good, but it has its limits. There are limitations to just how good we're going to feel as we give and as we give and as we give along the way. We may, in the process of time, experience a surge of generosity. Something happens, and you just feel totally moved, and you want desperately to give. But that same desire will not be there next week or the week after. It will fade away inevitably. And, of course, to some extent, that's the way it should be. For you may not be able to maintain that intense level of overabundant generosity that you experienced in that momentary flush when you were so excited about what was happening or what was being done. In other words, a need to look after yourself was also built into every human being. It is something that I think is what leads this situation of where, for example, I as a preacher come to you. I have a very real cause, a very real and urgent cause. And I make an appeal to you for a very special offering for this cause. I got tears running down all your faces, and I got you reaching for your checkbook before we ever get to the offering. And you sit down there and you write out a check far larger than you really have any business giving to anybody, more than you really can afford, but you are so moved and you so want to do it, and here comes this great gush of money coming in here. Okay, I count all the money up, and if I have this, and we're going to work the project over, and I give the money to it, and I take care of these things, and everything is going really well, but all of a sudden I get to next week, when you have overgiven, and time comes for you to make a contribution to the church as you routinely do, and you really don't have it, because you've got 2 or 3 other bills that you've got to pay. If you don't pay them, you're going to be out of your house, for example. You don't pay your rent. And if you don't pay your electricity, they're going to cut off your electricity right here in the middle of dead of winter, and you're not going to be able to heat your house. So you've got to pay it. And next week, I don't have as much money coming in. And the week afterward, I might have just a little bit less than that if I don't say something. And so pretty soon I begin to realize, hey, we've got a problem here. Because of this flush of money that came in, I got myself overextended over here, and now I have got to come back to you again and press you a little bit more. But this time it's not an opportunity, it's a crisis. And we must squeeze. All of us must now sacrifice because of the crisis that is now here, and I squeeze you a little bit harder. And so we go. Maybe day by day or month by month or year by year, getting into one bizarre or gimmicky fundraising technique after another, until finally we basically have got everybody giving about all they can possibly give, and we have exhausted the capacity of our congregation, of our whatever our group of people is, however widespread they are. We have exhausted their capacity to give to the work. This is the sort of thing I think that sometimes happens, and it grows out of a very natural state of affairs among human beings, that we can give. But there is such a thing as exhausting our capacity to give, and all of us have, as I say, the capacity to give in a surge, but we cannot maintain it, and we will begin to back off in our own self-interest, which God gave us for ourselves and for our family, will begin to assert itself, and we will then give less and less and less. Because as the Bible says, as goods are increased, they are increased that eat them. And there is never enough, and the pressures are always there. The erosion of your income and of your buying power is always there, and so the stress will continue. So, an awful lot of preachers have approached it by increased fundraising methods rather than by getting a handle on the spending and controlling the spending somewhere along the line. How has God approached this problem? How would He have you to approach it? How did He do it in the past? Really a very simple approach. He did it with consistent, proportional, sustained giving. It's called the tithe. 10% of one's income given consistently, proportionately, because the tithe is an even proportion for everybody, and it is sustained and sustainable over time. It's not a question of asking you to go out and give huge sums of money now, which you can never sustain over a period of time. What you are asked to give is something that you are expected to sustain over whatever period of time that it takes. The exact origins of tithing is really unknown. The practice is unknown. But the very most ancient reference to it is found back in the 14th chapter of Genesis. I'd like you to go back there with me. Let's see what we might learn about tithing from deep back close to its origin somewhere. Genesis chapter 14, and we'll begin reading, let's see, at verse 17. The king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer. What had happened is Sodom had been sacked by some kings. Lot had been carried off. I don't think Abraham would have even moved if it hadn't been for the fact that Lot was carried away in his family. But he gathered together a group of men, went off and defeated these kings that had destroyed Sodom, and spoiled them, took away from them what they had taken away from the king of Sodom. And he came back, laid it down with all of the goods from the slaughter, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him there. And, verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, that is Melchizedek, a tenth of everything. Now, whether he realized it or not, king of Sodom tithed. I mean, he did right there, because an awful lot of the stuff that Abraham had there belonged to the Sodomites. And so consequently, he gave a tenth of it to Melchizedek, and then eventually returns everything else that was left over back to the people concerned, because he said, I don't want you people saying that I have made Abraham rich. But he gave it, first of all, to this man. Now, was this just a random occurrence? Was it just an arbitrary response to Abraham, or something he just did? Or was there a significance attached to the act? Was it a meaningful event, in other words, as opposed to just something somebody did somewhere that we look at as an illustration? The commentary on this, some of us like to buy commentaries. One of your best commentaries on the Bible is the Bible. But the commentary on this segment you'll find in in Hebrews chapter 7. Paul, really through this whole segment, has a great deal to say about Melchizedek and about the priesthood, but the commentary on this particular segment is found right here. He says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. All right, we got ourselves located, haven't we, as to where we are. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, that's of everything. First being by interpretation, king of righteousness. Now this is the interpretation of who Melchizedek is. King of righteousness. After that, king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abides a priest continually. Now, there has been a lot of discussion, in fact, surprising lot of discussion over who Melchizedek is. To me, I see no room for discussion when we read through this passage and read the description and the titles handed to Melchizedek. He was the one, the priest of God of the old time, but he was the one who later became Jesus Christ. For we know clearly from the New Testament that Jesus Christ pre-existed. That is, he existed long before his human birth. As John puts it, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Saying very clearly that the Word was a being that was from the very beginning with the Father, and it was that Word that became flesh who was the one you and I call Jesus Christ. He manifested himself to Abraham as Melchizedek, a priest. He was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Isn't that eternal? Why, sure it is. So then the one called the eternal in the Old Testament is obviously the one that we are reading of here. Now, verse 4. Consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. Now that's interesting. What Paul is telling you here is that the act of tithing was an acknowledgement of the greatness of the one to whom the tithe was given. In other words, the lesser tithed to the greater. That tells you a great deal about the tithe, about the purpose of it. It wasn't merely a random event. It was an acknowledgement on Abraham's part of one much greater than himself. Verily, they that are the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have, present tense, a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they came out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. Without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes. Notice he's speaking in the present tense. The tithing law is not abolished. The Levites are still there. They're still active in service, and they're still receiving tithes according to the law. Jesus did not do away with that law. He then goes on to say, as I may so say, Levi also, who receives tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. What's the relevance of that? Why is that important? Simple. It is to acknowledge and to demonstrate on Paul's part the supremacy of the Melchizedek priesthood over the Levitical priesthood. Okay. How does he do that? He does it by citing the fact that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek in the loins of Abraham. Then what's the tithe for? It is to acknowledge that the other is greater. It is an acknowledgement of the supremacy of the one to whom the tithe is paid. Simple. If, therefore, perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? In other words, there was to come another priest who was not a Levite. That was Jesus Christ, who is a priest of the order of Melchizedek. That's a simple transition to make. And then he says, for the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. Now, there's been a great deal of conversation about whether that is the tithing law or not. And I really don't know why it's such a major question, because the only law under discussion here is the law of tithing. Now, we do understand that Abraham and Jacob paid tithes to Melchizedek, that Melchizedek had the right to receive tithes prior to Moses. So that when that priesthood was changed to a Levitical priesthood, there was of necessity a change that had to take place in the law so that Levi could receive the tithe. So the law was changed, and I will show you in a moment where it was made, to specify that Levi could receive the tithe. Then if the priesthood is to be changed back again, then there must of necessity also be a change in the law to provide for that tithe to go back again to Melchizedek as it had before. That is basically what Paul is here discussing. And that any law which pertained to the priesthood must of necessity be changed. Any time there is a change in the priesthood should be obvious to anyone. And tithing is a law which pertains to the priesthood, therefore it had to be changed as a result of that change. Now, what is the significance of the tithe? It is an act of obeisance, an act of worship, an acknowledging of the one who is greater. Now, let's go back to Genesis again, to the second reference in the Bible on tithing. Genesis 28 and verse 22. This one also is very important. Again, you get the feeling, well, is this just another random occurrence, or is there some meaning connected with this one as well? Genesis chapter 28. Sorry, I overshot my mark. Genesis 28, and we'll begin reading in verse 19. When Jacob awakened out of his sleep, he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. He had seen this vision of a ladder ascending up into heaven and so forth. He said, this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. He rose up early in the morning and took a stone that he had for his pillow. He set it up for a pillar and poured oil over the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you shall give me, I will surely give the tenth to you. Now, what is the meaning of all this? Well, there's several of things that I think are very, very important here. One is the obeisance or act of worship aspect that I've already mentioned with Abraham. Notice he said, then shall the Lord be my God. And a part of that acknowledging that the Lord was his God was the paying of tithes to God. So, this is an important point. The next item of meaning is that the tithe acknowledges that God is the source of all that he received. In other words, of all that God gives me. In other words, it is an acknowledgement that God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. It doesn't come from somewhere else. You get it from somewhere else. If you do not wish to acknowledge that it came from God, then it would not be tithable. But if it is something which you believe that God has given you, then it is tithable, should be tithed. Then he goes on to say, of all that you will give me. What do you tithe on? all that God gives you. How you define that? Well, you'll have to be the judge of that. But we begin to pick up quite a little bit of information as we go on. A later writer will say that you tithe on your increase. It's just another way of saying, of whatever God gives me, on that I will tithe. Now, there's another reference. We begin to get into references in the law back in Leviticus, if you'll turn to Leviticus 27. The interesting thing about this reference in Leviticus, however, is that it really is not the origin of the law of tithing. It presupposes the law of tithing. All this statement is, in Leviticus 27, beginning in verse 30, is an administrative statement of what to do about redeemable tithes. These are the only tithes that may be redeemed. Here are the circumstances whereby they may be redeemed. And it makes no statement about any other type of tithe. He says in verse 30, all the tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man will at all redeem anything of his tithes, he shall add the fifth part thereto. Concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock or whatever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy. You're not to search whether it's good or bad. And if he change it at all, both it and the change shall be holy, it shall not be redeemed. In other words, just a simple law saying these things are tithable. You may redeem some things you may not redeem. Here is how this is all done. It is not a comprehensive statement about tithing. Some people have tried to argue that this proves that tithing was only on the land, that is, upon agricultural produce. It's really a silly argument on the face of it. As I said, all it is a administrative statement. Jacob tells us what is tithe. He said, of all that you give me, I will surely give the tenth to you. Does a fisherman have no need for obeisance to God? Is there no need for him to acknowledge God as the source of his wealth? For indeed, that's what you're talking about if you say, well, nobody but farmers were supposed to tithe. Would you turn back over to Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter? There's a tremendously important scripture in this relationship that is often not cited because it doesn't use the word tithe, and consequently you won't find it if you're doing a search on tithe in your concordance. Deuteronomy chapter 8, and beginning in verse 10. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. And I can see some fellow sitting back from the table with his round belly in front of him and saying, oh, praise God for all the marvelous things that he has done. That's fine, I guess, as far as it goes. He says, beware that you forget not the Lord your God in not keeping his commandments. Oops. You mean there are some things we're supposed to do, not just things that we are supposed to say. Yeah, I'm afraid that's what it means. His commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command you this day. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built goodly houses and dwelt in them, when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God that brought you forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought you forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed you in the wilderness with manna which your fathers knew not, that he might humble you and that he might prove you to do you good at your latter end. Now he says, lest your heart be lifted up, lest you forget the Lord your God, who fed you in the wilderness, who did you all these things, and you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. Now you wouldn't say that, would you? But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he that gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore unto your fathers, as it is today. It shall be if you do at all forget the Lord your God, walk after other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day, you shall surely perish. I want you to think about that for a moment. Does a fisherman have no need for obeisance to God? Does he have no need to acknowledge God as the source of his wealth? If you fail to acknowledge God as the source of your wealth, are you not in effect saying, quote, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth? Can you adequately acknowledge God with mere words? Are deeds called for? What does Jesus say? I'm not going to read you a scripture. Do I have to read you a scripture for you to know what Jesus Christ said about whether words are enough? Is it enough for you to say, oh, praise God for all the wonderful things that God has done great things and God has done great works, and yet you never lift a finger to do anything about those good things God has given you and the good things that God has done? But you know what Jesus said about people who talk a good fight and never do anything about it, don't you? I'll leave it for you to search His words to find out what He said. Now, if we're going to say then that it isn't enough just to say praise God, but that deeds are called for, what deeds do you suppose we might suggest in the case of acknowledging that God is the one who gives you the power to get wealth? Children here, I'll bet you could tell you after listening this far. They'd say, well, Jacob said, of all that you give me, I will surely give the tenth to you. The Lord will be my God. That's not a really complicated concept. Now let's turn back to Numbers, the 18th chapter, where some additional extremely important principles are related to this question. In Numbers, the 18th chapter, and verse 20, the Lord spoke unto Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any part among them. I am your part and your inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, I have given... Now I'm just going to stop right there. Do you suppose that I would have any chance of giving away to you Larry Watkins' home? Well, I don't own Larry Watkins' home. Larry would take great exception to my giving away his home. What's my point? You don't give things that don't belong to you. All right. We established the fact that the tithe belongs to God. God says, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Okay, God gives what is His own. He gives it to Levi, but it is given conditionally upon service and for service. Someone once asked me if I could show them where the tithe was ever used in the Bible to preach the gospel. I turned right back here to Numbers, the 18th chapter, and said the Levites were given the tithe for their service, which they performed, and proceeded to point out to the gentleman that the only thing that ever went on in the temple was the proclaiming of the gospel. Every sacrifice, from peace offerings to burnt offerings, and there are preachers standing in the Baptist churches around this country that can get up every once in a while and give you a sermon that will stand your hair on end about how closely those sacrifices all point to Jesus. Every seminarian knows it. Everyone understands. And then people who have studied it see it clearly. The temple service and everything in it pointed to Christ and preached the gospel. You bet it did. The tithe went to the Levite at the sanctuary of God for the service of God in the temple, and it was purely for the purpose of proclaiming the gospel of God. Perhaps one of the purest examples of the proclaiming of that gospel by the tithe, and the most efficient proclaiming of it ever done. For the chance of waste was really minimized right there. Now right here, and we really need to understand all this. This temple, and what went on it was the work of God, and it was supported by His tithes. Interestingly enough, when the tithes weren't paid, the work stopped. Turn back to Nehemiah, if you would, for a rather interesting little scripture, just almost as a little byplay in the events of the time, but it's revealing. Nehemiah, the 13th chapter, in verse 10. Nehemiah says, I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. For the Levites and the singers that did the work, they'd left and gone everyone to his own field. They had to get something to eat. You know, if they didn't work their own fields, they were going to starve to death. Then I contended with the rulers of Israel and said, why is the house of God forsaken? I gathered them together and set them in their place, then brought all Judah, the tithe of the corn, the new wine, the oil to the treasuries, and I made treasurers over the treasuries, Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, the Levites, and so forth, laid them all out so that they could begin doing the work of God in the temple again. Why had it stopped? Because nobody was tithing. And when everybody stopped tithing, the priest said, well, I got to work for a living, fellas. I got to eat. I got a wife. I've got children. And so he went out and found his field and began to plow and put in a crop. That's all a man could do. Until Nehemiah grabbed everybody by the collar and said, wait, this is not right, and began to urge everybody once again to pay tithes so that the work of God could go forward. Also, a note just in passing, the tithe was not distributed all over the place, but it came to the central sanctuary to do the work of God in a central location. Now I want you to turn back with me to easily the most familiar scripture anywhere on tithing, I guess, one most quoted, in Malachi, the 3rd chapter, to pick up some additional principles on the subject. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 8. Will a man rob God? If the thought is astonishing, Stick up a grocery store, or a liquor store, certainly is. Maybe hold up a service station, but, stick a pistol in God's face and hold up God, or rob God, or burgle God's place? Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. And you say, well, how have I robbed you? This is a sequence in this book of Matthew where God, every so often, as he comes along, he'll say, you have done this. And the people all said, how have we done this? And then he begins to explain to them. Here were a bunch of apparently God-fearing people. They're religious people, certainly. They were people who believed in God. They believed in God's law, so that whenever the admonition came along and God said, look, you've not been doing right, they said, well, how have we not been doing right? Now, you and I would feel pretty shocked, wouldn't we, if God just came up to us and said, you've robbed me. Say, what? How have I robbed you? He says simply, in tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Now, this is a pretty important point then. The tithe belongs to God. In withholding it, you are not withholding what is your own. You are withholding or taking what belongs to another. That's the clear statement of Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Then he says, bring you all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Now what have we learned? We have learned that tithing is a commandment with promise. Remember that statement that he made about honor your father and your mother, for this is the first commandment with promise? What is the promise? That your days may be long upon the earth, which the Lord your God will give you. There comes the promise. Honor your father and your mother, and we want you to live long upon the land and so forth. Here's the other side of that. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse. There may meat in my house, and prove me, test me. See if I won't pour out a blessing that you won't be able to receive it. Okay, live long and prosper is the old saying that Spock on Star Trek used to have. Here are the two ingredients of live long and prosper. Honor your father and your mother, and bring all the tithes into the storehouse. Very simple. Now somebody says, well, I tithe and God didn't bless me. Well, there are people who've honored their father and their mother who died young too. There are exceptions, certainly. But this is a promise that God makes to mankind as a generality. You prove me, you test me out, you come to me and see if I won't bless you. I'd have to say that all the years that I have been a tither, I have certainly been blessed by God for doing so. I mean, the things have just, come my way again and again. They've dropped on our laps when we didn't feel we deserved them. We seem to have just been in the right place at the right time. Things have worked out for us and lasted longer than they should have, and so on it goes. Because of faithfulness, I believe, with God's tithe. I give God the credit for those things that he has done. And so it is that, we need to understand that there is a God in heaven, that tithing is a part of his law. And it is a part of his law that contains a promise that if we will honor him, if we will acknowledge him, if we will say like Jacob did, of all that you give me, I will give the tenth to you because I know you're the one that's giving it to me, then in making that statement, we do create a kind of a partnership with God. He says, I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes. He'll not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall the vine cast her fruit before its time in the field. All nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts. Did Jesus change all that? It's pretty clear as you read through it as to what God's law is. Did Jesus change all that? Well, you're probably familiar with Matthew 5:17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till everything come to pass. He didn't come to do away with the law. Did he ever acknowledge the law of tithing? Well, turn a few pages back further. Matthew 23 and verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you pay tithe. Oops, there you go. Just put your period right there, and you can see you've got yourself justified for not tithing. But look, he said, woe unto you, For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to have left the other undone. Jesus says that a man ought to tithe. Somebody said, well, Jesus said that under the old covenant and etc. You can really get into a can of worms. One teacher, one minister has said that essentially everything that Jesus ever said, in other words, every word of Jesus in the four Gospels, prior to his death and his resurrection, everything he said in there was under the old covenant and is in no way applicable to the Christian. Now that is astonishing to think about it, but really, there's not much middle ground. You can't very well just pick and choose through Jesus' sayings. If Jesus said you ought to tithe, and then somewhere else he says, well, you ought to be good to the poor, why would we say you don't need to tithe, but you do need to be good to the poor, if you follow me? I mean, just because we don't want to tithe and we do think it's good to be good to the poor, are we the standard? Are we the judge of what's right and what's wrong? It seems to me that when Jesus' teachings have to be taken as his teachings and used. Now, let's go back to Hebrews 7 again, because I think it's important for us to understand. Just to review the words that Paul wrote. Hebrews chapter 7, this time we'll begin in verse 4. Now consider how great this man, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. Verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who received the office of a priesthood, have a commandment, present tense, to take tithes of the people according to the law. And then he goes on to talk about all the ministry of Jesus and how that Levi, who paid tithes, received tithes in Abraham. Then he says later on in verse 17, for he testifies, this is of Jesus, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. There is verily a disannulling of the commandment going before, that is, the commandment making Levites priests, because of the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did. For those priests, verse 21, were made without an oath. But this one was with an oath, who said to him, the Lord swore and will not repent. This is to Jesus. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Jesus was the high priest following on, and as it says, the priesthood being changed, there is a necessity, a change also in the law. Now when Paul wrote this, the temple was still standing. The Levite was still qualified to receive the tithe. Jesus had not abolished the tithe. If he had, I don't think Paul would have used these words or spoken of it in this way. When the temple was destroyed and the Levites were scattered, the priesthood reverted to the Melchizedek order, and the tithe reverted as well. Paul made also, I think, a very interesting argument to the Corinthians. If you'll turn back again to 1 Corinthians, this time chapter 9. This has been a much disputed chapter relevant to tithing, but I think it's important to understand what it was that Paul was saying here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, keep in mind now that the temple is still standing. And as of this point in time, tithing has not even been an issue raised in the church, for nobody has really thought that much about it as far as whether the tithe should be done or not. The temple is there, the Levites are there, the service is being performed. My church members went in and shaved their heads and performed the vows of the Nazarites during this period of time, much less would they tithe. So anyway, he says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not you my work in the Lord? What's he talking about? If I be not an apostle to others, I have to be to you, for the seal of my apostleship is you in the Lord. My answer to them that examine me is this: do we not have the power to eat and drink? Have we not the power or authority to lead about a sister or a wife like the other apostles and the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? What in the world is he talking about? Is he talking about getting married? That doesn't seem logical, especially in view of the next verse. Or I only in Barnabas? Do we not have the power to forbear working? Oh, now wait a minute. You realize what he's talking about here? Up until this point, the Apostle Paul has worked with his hands and has refused to take any money himself personally, nor has Barnabas apparently, from these people. You know, he did take money. Don't make no mistake about that. The Philippians sent money to him several times from up in their area. But he never took money of the Corinthians. Now, what are you saying to them? He's saying, now, why do you think I did this? Do you think it was because I didn't have the authority to forbear working and accept offerings, at least from you people? Well, of course. But I want you to pay attention to that word authority, the word power. It's rather interesting what he talks about here. He then goes on, you stop and think about it for a moment. How much power do I have over your offerings? None, really. I mean, if it's an offering, if it's a free will offering, and if you're supposed to make your own decision about how much you can give $1, you can give $5, you can give $100. If you give $100, I mean $1, you don't convey much power. And I don't have any power to determine what that offering is. I could try to persuade you to give a little bit more, but I have no authority where your offerings are concerned. What's he talking about then? Read on. I only and Barnabas, do we have the power to forbear working? Who goes to warfare any time at his own charges? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat the fruit? In other words, does a soldier have to pay his own way? He said, if a man plants a vineyard, doesn't he get to eat some of the fruit? Who feeds a flock and does not eat the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a man, or doesn't the law say the same thing also? Now, this is interesting. Here's the Apostle Paul writing to a Gentile congregation, and he's going to make an appeal to an authority. Where are you going to appeal? You know, are you going to say, well, Jesus said it? Like, Jesus isn't there to repeat it for him. And they have to say, well, you say Jesus said it. How do we know Jesus said it? He didn't appeal to Jesus. He didn't appeal to Peter. He didn't appeal to James or any other authority. He appealed to the law in writing to a Gentile congregation, and not just the law of Moses. He says, it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. Does God take care for oxen? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that plows should plow in hope. He that threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we reap your carnal things? If we just reach in there and just take of your physical things. Is that a big deal, since I have sown to you spiritual things, Paul asks? Rather striking, the way he's approaching this subject as he goes on. But what is really especially interesting, writes to a Gentile church and appeals to the law of Moses. Which law some people feel is done away, but if it was done away, why in the world would Paul quote it? Why would he cite it? Why would it even have any meaning for these people? The answer is, Paul didn't believe the law of Moses was done away with. He did believe that it needed to be interpreted, it needed to be administered and applied in the Spirit in this world, in this way, and among these people in a way that fits them. And he reaches out and says, I have a right to be supported by this congregation. Have the authority to reach in and reap of your physical things. He said, I haven't done it, but I have had the right. Then he said, if others be a partaker of this power over you, aren't we rather? So somebody had been. You know, whoever the ministers were who were active in Corinth had been taking money from these people. He said, don't we have the power rather? But we haven't used this power. We suffer all things lest in any way we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Beautiful example. But you know, there is an implication here in what he says by the use of the term power, that he is dealing with something that has the authority of law. Whereas free will offerings, really, there's not too much power. As I said there, those are your decision. You make that decision. The one thing you don't really have that much latitude in is the tithe. He goes on then to say, don't you know that they that minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they that wait at the altar are partakers of the altar? Who are we talking about? The Levites. How are the Levites supported? All the children will know, tithes, because that's what we're talking about. Even so, same way, has the Lord ordained that they that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I haven't used these things, lest I should hinder, as he says, the gospel of Christ. It would be better for me to die than that any man should make my glory void. Direct connection to the Levite service, which was by the tithe. Now, as I said, he didn't use the word tithe, didn't refer to it in that way, because even yet I suspect that it was a delicate issue, if it was an issue, had been raised, as to whether or not the tithe had to be sent to Jerusalem, or whether it could be used here locally, or whatever else it was. But I suspect that he was talking about the tithe. For the wording doesn't seem to quite come through. if you're just talking about anything else. Now, what have we learned so far about the tithe? We've learned it's an act of obeisance, of worship, of acknowledgement of the greatness of God. We've learned that it acknowledges God as the source of all material wealth. We have learned that the tithe is a tenth of all that God gives to you. We have learned that the tithe is a means of financing God's work. We have learned that the tithe belongs to God. We have learned that the tithe is a commandment with a promise of blessing. We have learned that Jesus Christ himself acknowledged the tithing law. It's a lot there. Now, of course, questions could arise. What if somebody is abusing it? One of the most striking illustrations of this happened in the Old Testament times. It wasn't the tithe. It was a little different. The priest normally had a right to certain of the offerings that were made in the temple. In other words, if somebody came up and he offered an animal, not only, he was going to eat most of it. Most of the animals, you may not realize this, were not just burned whole on the altar and wasted. Parts of them were burned. The fat was burned. But then the person cooked right there, and they'd have big pots seething there and cooking up big meals. The people ate most of that animal. But the priest, because of his service and his work, and he had to actually kill the animal ceremonially and go through the making of the atonement, he was able to put a flesh hook in there and take out what happened to come up with it, and he could go his way, and he had a meal for himself and his family as a result of what he did today. Nothing big there. But Eli's sons began to abuse this privilege. And they would go to people, and they'd say, we don't want to just take meat out of your pot. We want you to give it to us raw so we can cook it the way we want, or we want it roasted, or we want it this way, or we want it that way. And they began to take not just the normal portion, but much, much larger portions of the people. And it got to the place, to use the words of the person writing 1 Samuel, they caused the offering of the Lord to be abhorred. They got people where they just hated to give. They hated to go up there. They hated to go through the thing, but they had to face these two idiots of Eli's sons who were doing this kind of behavior. And it just became a noisome, obnoxious thing to them. The same sort of thing, I think, has happened from time to time in churches, where tithing, where the tithe, even the method of collecting the tithe has been abused, in the principle of people using coercion and disfellowshipment in order to try to make people do it. And then once the money is gotten in hand, the money is used for everything under the sun except what God ordained it to be used for. Oh, it's not hard to see how a person gets to the place to where he wouldn't want to tithe, to where he would say it's being abused. I just don't see any point in doing it. And he'd come to the place to where it would cause the offering of the Lord and the tithe of God to be abhorred in people's minds. I think the problem with it, though, is a person has to be very careful at a time like that, lest he find himself become to be abhorring God, to where he come to begin blaming God, to where he allow the abuses of men to become an excuse for his own failures and his own abuses, which he then begins to perpetuate. It's a very serious matter, I think, to decide I'm not going to obey God because of the abuse of certain individuals who may be taking offerings or misusing them or doing it the wrong way. It's something for a person to think very long and hard about, because there's more than one way of tithing and giving to God than just simply having to do it the way some of us at one time believed we had to, through one organization and one organization alone. Another thing that's oftentimes been a problem is, what about the very poor? It's always been a difficult question for me. I remember many years ago sitting up in the mail reading department and, slitting open a letter and pulling it out. And here's a letter from a little old lady who had gotten one of these crisis letters and said, well, I had this money saved up for a new pair of shoes. And she said, but when I got your letter, I just feel God's work needed it more than I did. And here it is, $5 bill, just enclosed, wrapped up in her letter, and so forth. Felt rotten, really felt rotten about that, especially in view of the fact that what was happening here was crisis fundraising. This was crisis fundraising and reaching out and taking something like this. And then I'd also think, though, that the chances are that woman got an awful lot out of that herself anyway, because it made her feel a part of something much bigger than herself. It made her world bigger and made her feel, like she was a part of this organization and helping this college and so forth. One just wishes that, it could have been done a little bit differently. It's a difficult question. When someone is poor and they say, well, should I, I only got this amount of money, should I tithe on this? There is a beautiful thing about the tithe. When a man is down to his last dollar, God does not demand it all. All he asks you for is a dime. Just a dime. Funny thing I have found, when this question of the poor is raised, though, it's rarely the poor that have that bigger problem with it. For the poor man, he's got a dollar, and all he's got to give is a dime. And, you know, it seems like pretty easy to do, to give a dime. Where the problem becomes different is when you got more. And the tithe is, of course, proportionate. And consequently, you have to give more. And oftentimes, it's not the poor person that struggles with it, but someone else. But I'm reminded of, I never forget reading this, and it comes up periodically as I teach Old Testament survey, and it never failed to move me. Elijah the prophet comes into a place, and there's a woman and a child. And it's a time of terrible famine. And of course, the famine to some extent was induced by Elijah, by him praying there wouldn't be any rain. It wasn't, nothing had been grown. Everything had been eaten except for just enough meal and oil to make one small cake of bread. And Elijah said, "What do you have there?" And he said, "Well, sir," she said, "it's the last of my meal and my oil. And I'm going to bake a cake for my son and we can eat it, and then we're going to die." Because there was nothing left. That was the last thing. And Elijah looked that woman right in the face and said, "Make for me first." I would have choked on the words. My ears would have burned. I would have been so, flushed with embarrassment. I don't think there is any way that I could have ever made that statement. I would have burned with shame over making that kind of a statement. But Elijah saved their lives. Saved their lives. For until the end of that famine, every time she went back to the barrel of meal, there was meal there. Every time she returned to the cruse of oil, there was oil there. And when Elijah arrived, there was only enough for one cake left for these people. And I asked myself, why should I be ashamed to point you toward God? Why should I be embarrassed to suggest that you ought to do obeisance to Him? That you ought to honor Him as the source of every good and perfect gift, as the source of all those good things that come your way? Why should I be embarrassed to ask you to rededicate yourself to Him and to acknowledge Him as your ruler, as Abraham did, and the source of everything you have?